Hi, my name is Kim Hasarud. If you're watching this, you have probably gotten your honey varietal tasting kit. I have a consultancy called Liquid Architecture. I work with hundreds of hotels and restaurants and liquor brands. I've also written 8 cocktail books, but I am also a self-proclaimed honey ambassador. I am a honey fanatic. When I used to create drinks with honey, I used to think of it more of as a flavor. And so when I put honey drink on a menu, I would have my one honey cocktail. But about 7 years ago, I really started exploring just the world of honey varietals and started pairing those with spirits. And what happened, it just opened up Pandora's box for me. Because what I found was just how complex and nuanced honey is. And when I pair those with different spirits, particularly gin, I could enhance some of those botanicals by using different varietals. So we're going to get a little more into detail a little bit later, but first let's unpack our kit. So this is the basic honey varietal kit. You may have gotten an upgrade, which includes anything from glassware to a mini cocktail shaker, additional honey varietals, and it would have come in a bigger kit like that. This big kit has everything this small kit does too, plus a few extras. So you're going to get a little recipe card, and it's got some of our partners in there. So if you are going to post to social media, please tag us. And on the back is a bee's knees recipe. So this is what we're going to make a little bit later. So got the recipe card. There may be 1 or 2 other recipes as well. This one's for grilled citrus honey lemonade. And we have our tasting map. So you're just going to fold it out and you're going to place it right out in front of you. You also should have a little bag of tasting spoons and a souvenir honey drizzle stick. So just put this tasting spoons aside. This honey drizzle stick, you can just dip into your favorite honey and drizzle it over, your waffles, yogurt, or ice cream. And I'll take out the honey varietals. So there should be 5 in your package, or if you did order extras, there may be some other honey varietals to choose from. We're only going to focus on the 5. If you did order extra varietals, just taste those at your own leisure. I didn't include tasting notes for those because I'm just getting whatever seasonal varietals I can get my hands on at that moment. But on your map, every varietal, the main 5 varietals will have a color-coded sticker. So this one is green, for example, and that corresponds with this green box. So green is the alfalfa honey. And orange or gold will be orange blossom. Red will be clover. Purple will be wildflower. And blue will be buckwheat. So we're going to taste these in a little bit, but first, this whole presentation is called the Beekeeper's Notebook. So on this tasting sheet, I gave you lots of room to include your own tasting notes when we get to that section, as well as a little more information about these varietals. But we're going to jump into the presentation where I want to talk about everything bees, everything from how honey is made, hive construction, bees' role in agriculture, the many forms of honey, and how to use honey in drinks, particularly cocktails, and finally a demo of the bee's knees. The bee. She's a cute little girl, isn't she? This is the genus Apis, also known as the honeybee. There are over 20,000 known species of bees, but only 7 of those species produce honey. The western honeybee is the most common. Honeybees are distinguished from other bees by their production and storage of honey and the construction of hives. Just for some added context, this is the bumblebee. It's ironic because this bee is often what we see in stories and cartoons and movies as being the atypical honeybee, the big fuzzy golden black striped insect, but the bumblebee doesn't actually produce honey. The honeybee is such an amazing insect with an amazing story. What bees are capable of doing as a hive is just phenomenal. The honeybee is the only insect that produces a food that humans eat. Many people in countries eat a lot of insects, but the bee is the only one that actually produces a food source that humans and other animals eat. It has 6 legs, 2 compound eyes, 3 simple eyes, 2 pairs of wings, a nectar pouch, and a stomach. Its wing speed reaches 200 beats per second. That's extremely fast, and we'll talk about why that's important in a little while. In a beehive, there are 3 types of bees: the drone, the queen bee, and the worker bee, and each of them play a critical role in the hive. The queen bee has a lifespan of a few years, and she will have only one mating event, mating anywhere from 1 to a dozen drones at one time. That event will allow the queen to produce up to 2,000 eggs a day and up to 1 million eggs in her lifetime. If the queen bee gets sick or the worker bee feels like she's getting close to the end of her life, the worker bees will select just a few of the larvae which will develop into a queen by feeding it royal jelly. When those larvae eat the royal jelly, a new queen will emerge in about 16 days. Royal jelly is like mother's milk. It's secreted by the nurse bee, and a diet on this jelly alone alters the genetics of the bee. So if there is more than one queen that emerges, it's a fight to the death or flight. They leave and start their own hive. This is what the queen looks like in a hive. You can see she's about 1.5 times bigger than the worker bees. Often a beekeeper will mark the queen just by putting a small dot of paint right on top of the bee. And that's to make sure that he can find her at all times to make sure she's safe. The queen bee literally spends her entire life eating royal jelly and laying eggs. Those are nurse bees that are surrounding her, feeding her, and the larvae protecting them. One interesting thing to note is that the hive will behave in a manner that is like the queen. So if the queen is really docile, the rest of the hive will be really docile. If the queen is aggressive, the hive will also be aggressive. So sometimes a beekeeper that has a hive that is aggressive, he'll replace the queen in the hopes of having a more docile queen and a more docile hive. Or if the hive gets swarmed and a new queen emerges that is aggressive, those former docile bees will become aggressive. This is the bee that you see 99.9999% of the time. This one looks like she's actually cleaning out the honeycomb and getting it ready for an egg to be laid or for honey storage. The worker bee makes up almost the entire population of honeybees, and they are all sterile females, and they do everything: clean, care for the larva, build cells, tend to the queen, store honey, forage, pollinate, guard the hive, feed drones if they're begging for honey. Their roles are built into their genetic code, and their hormones activate part of their genetic makeup that tells them what to do and when to do it. So there are 4 stages of the worker bee. The first stage, they're actually working even before they emerge from their cells. They first start to eat through the cell so that they can emerge from it and start to work cleaning and maintaining their cell. After about 3 days, their hormones tell them to start tending to the larva, where they feed and tend to the queen. This stage lasts for about a week. The third stage is becoming kind of just a general handyman around the hive, doing everything from cleaning the hive, building cells, storing food, capping the food or honey, and they start moving away from the center of the hive. The final stage, and the most dangerous stage, is the foraging phase. They leave the hive and forage for nectar and bring it back to the hive. That stage lasts for about 2 weeks. The lifespan of a worker bee also depends on the time of year and where the bees are. During the summer or locations with warmer weather, it has only a lifespan of about 6 weeks. They literally work themselves to death. During the winter, the lifespan is much longer, and it can be anywhere from 4 to 9 months. When it's cold, they're feeding on the stored honey, and they create a winter cluster around the queen to make sure she's continuing to lay eggs and keeping her and the other bees warm. And finally, the drone bee. These are the only male bees. They're a little bit bigger than the worker bee. They don't do any work and are stingless. They just kind of hang out until the queen bee is ready to mate with them. And when they do finally mate, it actually kills them. The queen bee, on the other hand, mates with, again, anywhere from a few to a dozen drones, and usually from a different colony. The new queen bee will leave the hive, mate, and come back. But in the autumn, when the bees are getting ready for winter and are storing honey, there really isn't use for the drone anymore, so the nurse bees stop feeding them and they starve to death. I know. Poor male bee, they live for that one moment in life. Hives can come in many different shapes and sizes. This is a wild hive that just formed on the branch of a tree. But bees can form a hive anywhere, under roofs, in walls, under stairs, inside trees, you name it, anywhere where they feel like it's an enclosed area where they will feel protected and safe. So this is a hive box from an apiary. A typical hive can have anywhere from 10,000 to 60,000 bees at one time. They just keep stacking those honey super boxes on top of each other as the colony continues to grow. This is the internal architecture of an apiary hive. So starting from the bottom, you have the stand and the floor. Above that is the brood box. This is the beginning hive with the queen where she lays her eggs, and it's in this box where bees are born. The brood box includes trays and the trays in which all the bees are born. There's another tray above that called the queen excluder. So this allows the worker bees to come in and out and roam around the hive, but it's just small enough that it excludes the queen from going all around the hive. And that's intentional because, again, the beekeeper wants to make sure he knows where the queen is at all times and making sure that she's safe. So above that, the beekeeper can continue to add honey supers and just stack on top of each other. They usually keep one that the bees eat and store, and all the honey above that is harvested. This is a beekeeper taking out one of the trays in the honey super, and you can see this beekeeper has a scraper in their hand. So that's what they use to scrape out the honeycomb or decap the honeycomb, getting ready for harvest. But sometimes they just need to do general maintenance. You know, the bees will start to form a hive in the corners of the hive, and sometimes it makes it difficult for the beekeeper to take those trays out. So they just scrape the sides, making it easy. And again, they want to make sure that no bees are getting harmed. Here you can see the beekeeper scrapes off that capped honeycomb and is getting ready to harvest it. So from here, that tray goes into a centrifuge, usually a hand cranked one, where the honey is forced out of the honeycomb. Once the honey is extracted from the honeycomb, the beekeeper needs to filter it. One important note is that filtering honey is not processing honey. All beekeepers have to filter their honey because sometimes there are wings or bee legs, bits of pollen, dirt, petals that get caught in the air and the honey, and all of that stuff just needs to get filtered out. Filtering honey, I mean, this is about as processed as honey gets. Filtering, nothing is added. Now we're going to get into a little more detail about pollination. Pollen is a powdering substance produced by plants. It's basically like plant sperm. It's usually caught by the wind current and other insects and carried to pollinate plants with that genetic material. Bees play such an important role in pollination. As they are gathering nectar from flowers and blossoms, those pollen particles stick to their body and legs as they travel from flower to flower, and it drops the pollen, helping with fertilization. Of the world's 115 most important food crops, 87 require pollination to produce fruits, nuts, and seeds. About 1/3 of the U.S. diet is derived from insect-pollinated plants, and honeybees are responsible for about 80%. That's $3 trillion worth of agricultural produce, about 35% of the calories we consume. Our food world would be dramatically different if we didn't have bees to sustain the food we eat. These are just a few of the foods that bees are responsible for pollinating. So honey is actually a byproduct of agriculture. Just to give you some added context, this is a pollinating map, and this is just one route that some beekeepers take. So there are professional beekeepers that are taking their hives on the road to pollinate these crops around the United States. So this is one map that shows you the route that some of these beekeepers may take. So if you're starting on the West Coast, the bees are pollinating, strawberries, citrus, almonds. They move up to Oregon and Seattle, Washington, where they are pollinating everything from cherries to more citrus to clover. Some go to the Midwest, like in Michigan, or further south where they're pollinating sunflowers, making their way over to the West Coast. You've got blueberries over here, more citrus. But, I think what this map shows you too is that agriculture is the main function of how we use bees, and the fact that we get honey from that is just a much smaller byproduct than their most critical role, which is agriculture. So what is nectar and how does it go from nectar to honey? Well, nectar is a sugar-rich liquid produced by plants in glands called nectaries. It has a very sweet scent, and the blossoms themselves are what attract pollinators such as bees. So the nectar contains about 80% water and the rest are complex sugars. This is the main sugar source for the creation of honey. The first step is that nectar is extracted from the flower by the bee's tongue and stored in the bee's stomach. The enzymes start to break down those complex sugars to simple sugars. So one thing to note about this image, you can see the bee's legs. The bee has built up pollen on their legs, which actually form into granules. So if the beekeeper wants to collect that, they just put a little grate on the entrance of their hive. So as the bee comes back to their hive, those granules just fall out off their legs. I love using bee pollen. I love using bee pollen in yogurt, in salads. I also think it makes an awesome cocktail garnish. Once the forager bee comes back with the nectar, it regurgitates it from its stomach and transfers it to another bee. So the hive bee is also digesting and adding enzymes in its stomach, regurgitates it into a cell of the honeycomb. While this is happening, the bees are also fanning their wings to remove extra water from the honey, thickening it. The bees then seal the comb with beeswax. A few fun facts. 1 pound of honey equals 2 million flower blossoms visited, 55,000 miles flown, and 22,700 bees. One colony of bee makes anywhere from 60 to 100 pounds of honey a year, and one bee makes 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey in their lifetime. Now for the fun part. We're going to jump into the properties and forms of honey. There is a lot more to honey than meets the eye, so first I'm going to break it down by color. Honeys can really vary in shade from being almost clear, like water white, to dark amber. The shading is also on the tasting map at the very bottom. Over time, honeys have a tendency to darken, but it does not affect the flavor. And typically, lighter honeys have more delicate flavors, while darker honeys tend to have stronger, more savory flavors. So these are all of the flavors and aromatics that can be found in honeys. It ranges from floral notes like violet rose to being fruity like raspberry, mango, dried fruits like raisin, fig, to citrus like grapefruit, orange, lemon. There are also warm flavors in honey like caramel, burnt sugar, maple, coffee, cooked butter. And even like the herbaceous fresh notes like mint, eucalyptus, rosemary, and even some vegetal flavors like hay, grass, tea, squash, and even some woody like notes like cedar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and some earthy, funky flavors like mushroom, forest floor, and truffle. Liquid honey is the most common form of honey. It's extracted from the honeycomb, filtered, and then free of visible crystals. Crystallized honey is just liquid honey that has lost water content, and some honeys crystallize faster than others. If you go to your farmer's market and get the honey there, often like local honeys tend to crystallize a little bit faster. In some cultures and countries, people love crystallized honey for the texture, that bit of crunch on toast, for example. But I find it kind of interesting because in America, people love honey to be super consistent. So sometimes people think if it starts to crystallize that it's going bad and they'll throw it away. But if you don't like it, just pop it in the microwave for about 30 seconds and it should liquefy pretty quickly. Whipped honey is just honey that is being whipped. It's a little fluffier, has a creamy mouthfeel, and easily spreadable. Whipped honey is also good to add additional flavors like pink salt, which is really great in a whipped honey. It almost kind of has a salted caramel flavor to it. Other flavors to incorporate into whipped honey would be like lavender, chocolate, or coffee, all really great additions to whipped honey. Granulated honey is basically dehydrated honey. If you do buy granulated honey, just be sure to check the label and make sure it states 100% pure honey. Some granulated honeys, they add stabilizers and anti-caking ingredients for cooking. I love granulated honey for cocktail rims. It's killer in a classic sidecar. So honeycomb is made by the bees, and it's what bees make to store the honey. It's 100% edible. It's waxy and chewy, kind of like a gum. It also has a nice buttery flavor to it. I love using it as garnishes for drinks and infusions. It's so good when infused in spirits like gin, tequila, rum, and cognac. All right, we are ready to start tasting through these honey varietals. So you have your tasting map in front of you, and let's go ahead and open the seal of all these honey varietals and add your little tasting spoon to each jar. Okay, so the first one we're going to taste is alfalfa, and you'll notice like it usually we're going to go from lighter to darker. Now some of these honey varietals, they may darken over time. So if this is a little bit darker than your clover honey, it's not a big deal. Again, some honeys darken over time, but the flavor will all be consistent and the same. So again, we're going to start with the alfalfa honey. And when you taste honey, what I want you to do is I want you just to take a little spoonful, and I want you just to put it up on top of the tongue and just let it slowly dissolve in your mouth. So alfalfa honey is found in the Midwest states and the West Coast. Usually an extra light amber. Some of the aromatics that I get are kind of sweet, grassy, almost a hay-like. I think it's pretty herbaceous, grassy. I even get like some more vegetal notes, a little beeswaxy too. Really, really nice. So the next one is orange blossom. Orange blossom, it comes from mainly California, Arizona, Texas, and Florida. It's a pretty abundant crop, but even like on the flavor and the aromatics, you definitely get like that jasmine, orange peel, citrus notes. It's almost even a little perfumey. And next is clover. So this is an amber colored. Clover is probably one of the most abundant crops in the US. And that's why if you are visiting an industrial kitchen or a restaurant and there's like a jug of honey in their dry storage, chances are it's probably clover. I like clover. I think it's a great all-around honey. I get a lot of baking spices, almost some butterscotch, a little bit of cinnamon. And I think it works well in almost all spirits. But I really like that kind of sweet cream, vanilla flavors to it. And then finally, let's do wildflower. So wildflowers are found all over the US, and wildflower is the notation or the varietal that a beekeeper will put on a varietal if they know their bees have been eating a variety of flowers or they can't really pinpoint the flower. But also wildflower too is extremely regional. So when you are buying wildflower, from region to region, they can be dramatically different. So that's a great regional varietal to go for, is wildflower. And then finally, we're going to taste buckwheat. It's so savory. There is it's kind of malty, like almost coffee, dark chocolate. It's got a little barnyard funk to it. Now, when you're tasting through these, on the bottom of the tasting map, there's a little section for notes. So feel free to pause or go back and take some of your own notes, because you know, honeys, and just like when you're tasting wine, it can be very subjective based on your background and what you've tasted before. So feel free to write your own notes. So when you're thinking about these characteristics in the honeys that we just tasted, and you're adding them to cocktails, now all of these characteristics, you can actually start to enhance different characteristics in cocktails. So we're going to jump to the bee's knees. If you are gonna stick around for the bee's knees demo, great. Please do not eat all of your honey, because we're using this honey to make the bee's knees cocktail. So now is a good time to pause the video, make sure you have all of the ingredients for the bee's knees that's listed on the recipe and your tools. You may have gotten the upgraded kit, which looks like this. And again, it's everything that this kit has, but it may also have anything from like the 2-pack sour glass, the cocktail shaker, and so a signed book. There's other varietals and some other things in there too that you may or may not get. But go ahead and pause the video and we will be right back and do this bee's knees demo. All right, so we're ready to make the bee's knees. But before we do that, we actually need to prepare the honey. We have to make a honey syrup. If I were to make a cocktail and just pour honey directly like into a lemonade with ice in it or into a cocktail shaker with ice, it would just harden. It wouldn't dissolve. So I need to add a little bit of hot water just to make it so it can dissolve better into a cocktail. So hopefully if you didn't eat all of your honey, we're gonna make honey syrups out of all of these. And you could just do it, you could kind of eyeball it. It doesn't have to be exact, but I'm gonna do like a 2-to-1. So I'm actually gonna make a honey syrup out of all of these. So I'm just gonna go and add, I have access to hot water. So I'm just gonna add a little bit of hot water to each one. I don't want to fill it up with hot water. You want to leave enough space, so we're going to shake these and make sure they're all dissolved. So like you can kind of see that. That's pretty good. So like a 2-to-1 ratio, 2-to-1 honey and 1 to hot water. All right, good deal. Okay. So let's talk about gin. Let's talk about gin first. So the bee's knees is a classic cocktail, and it actually gained notoriety during Prohibition, which sounds kind of odd. Like, why would a cocktail gain so much notoriety during Prohibition when alcohol was abolished? Well, the 20s, as you may have read in some of the history books, the Roaring 20s with like flapper dresses, right? But those were all in speakeasies. So even before Prohibition happened, there was this big movement to abolish alcohol because everything that was wrong with America, it was alcohol, 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 alcohol. So these teetotalers were really successful in convincing politicians that if they just abolished alcohol, it would rid America of its problems, right? We see kind of a lot of the same kind of rhetoric in politics today. But what ended up happening was Prohibition actually had the opposite effect of its intent, because you always want what you can't have, right? So speakeasies thrived. They just exploded. Everything went underground, but all the great bartenders of the day left, went on to other countries to start their own bars and businesses, because, you know, the bartender at the time was a pretty well-established and great profession, but because now all the bars are really underground and speakeasies, nobody's going to go work for a mobster, so they all left. And the alcohol they were getting were either from rum runners, or they were making their own moonshine and calling it gin just by throwing in a bunch of botanicals. And that's where the term bathtub gin came in. It was pretty lethal in some cases, where you just had people they were literally making it in a bathtub and just putting all kinds of botanicals just to try to make it somewhat taste like the gin that they knew. And what better way to try to make this really bad spirit taste good than to add honey and lemon juice to it? So this was the cocktail that they used in bathtub gin. Obviously, this cocktail has become a lot more refined since then. So that's where the bee's knees came from, and I'm going to talk a little bit about gin too. So when I was bartending, I'm totally going to date myself, back in the 90s, there were literally like 3 gins on the market, right? But we're still going through this huge gin renaissance. And what I love about gin, if you don't like gin, you just have not had the right gin cocktail. And the bee's knees is one of those cocktails that's a good converter. People that don't like gin, if you make them a bee's knees, they're probably gonna like gin. Why gin is so exciting to a mixologist is that there are so many botanicals used. Every gin maker has their own formula of botanicals, and that's why there's such a wide range of gins out there on the market. So I'm going to talk about 2 different styles, and we're going to use 2 different varietals and 2 different bee's knees and see how that changes the flavor. So I'm going to start with Sipsmith. Sipsmith is a London Dry style gin. London Dry doesn't necessarily mean that it has to come from London, although a lot of them do, and this one does. But one of the characteristics about a London Dry gin is that it has a lot of structure and backbone. And while all gins have to be made with juniper, that's what denotes it from like a neutral grain spirit, for example. One of the most notable things about a London Dry gin is that the primary flavor and aromatics needs to be juniper. So when you open up the top, and you smell those aromatics, you get that pine needle. You get that, that black pepper. You get a little bit of citrus. Oh, it's just so good and balanced. Smith in particular, I know they use some cinnamon bark, some angelica root, orris root. They have both lemon and orange peel in here. And for the mouthfeel, they actually have some ground almonds too, which kind of gives it a little bit of a creamy texture. So when I'm thinking about the kind of varietal that I want to pair this with, a few of them come to mind. So I think I want to try this with orange blossom. I get a little bit of citrus notes in here, but I actually want to enhance that element. So I'm going to use orange blossom for this bee's knees in this cocktail. So if you did get the upgraded kit, you might have this little cocktail shaker, the sour glass. You might have some little honeycomb as a garnish, but if you don't, hopefully you've got all of those ingredients ready to go. So we're going to use 2 ounces of Sipsmith gin. Okay, and then I've got, I'm going to use 1 ounce of the honey syrup. If you don't have a full ounce, you can use 3/4. That's okay. So whatever ounce you used of the honey, whether it's 1 ounce or 3/4 ounce, make sure you're using that same amount in lemon juice. So that was 3/4 honey syrup and 3/4 ounce lemon juice. All right, we're going to give that a good shake. Okay, and then because I did that orange blossom honey, I'm actually going to garnish it with an orange peel. So I like to actually peel it right over the cocktail because I still get some of those oils from the skin that fall down. And then when you squeeze it, make sure you're getting as little of the pith as possible. The white pith is a little bit bitter and you're squeezing it down. So this is where all of the oils are. So I want to make sure I'm getting all of those oils as much as possible right on top of that cocktail. All right, let's give it a taste. Ah, that is so floral with that orange blossom. I get just this explosion, this orange bouquet and aromatics and oil. That is so lovely. So the Sipsmith, you still get the structure of the London Dry Gin. You still get that juniper. You get a little bit of that black pepper spice, but that's overlaid by this really beautiful orange floral notes, which is just great. That is a beautiful bee's knees. Okay, so this next gin we're going to talk about is Roku. This is a Japanese crafted gin. Roku means the number 6, and it's the primary botanicals are 6 botanicals, and it's supposed to highlight like the 4 seasons of Japan. All 6 of the botanicals are sourced from Japan. So there's yuzu peel, sakura flower, sakura leaf, sancho pepper, and a couple of different teas, including sencha. Whoa. So the aromatics of this gin are, I mean, it is like a bouquet of flowers. So I get aromatics of like lavender and rose hip. It's a really, really pretty gin. So when I think about what kind of varietal that I want to pair this with, I think if I were to pair it with the orange blossom, it might push those florals over the top. So I don't want to enhance that element, but I think the alfalfa honey would be really well in this gin, where maybe I could actually bring up some more of those tea notes, which are in the background in this gin. So let's try it with the alfalfa. So same recipe, it's going to be 2 ounces of Roku gin. And then I'm going to do 3/4 of an ounce of the alfalfa honey syrup. 3/4 ounce of fresh lemon juice. All right, let's give that a good shake. Oh. Got to add ice. All right. Okay. And then for the garnish, because I want to bring up some of those tea notes and I've got the lemon juice, I think it'd be really pretty with the lemon peel. So I'm going to peel that right over. And I'm also going to garnish it with some honeycomb too. I just love honeycomb as a garnish. I think it's so pretty. All right. Oh, I mean, just lemon peel alone just does wonders for a cocktail. I mean, you just get that fresh, it's almost like a fresh cut lemon smell just right off the top. Wow. These cocktails are night and day. Both are beautiful and amazing, but they're so different. So this cocktail, the alfalfa does bring up those tea notes. And you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of like sun tea, the tea that's been sitting out for a while. So it has, you know, that kind of sits in the back of your throat, but you can also get that fresh lemon slice that's in there. So I really get a lot of that like green tea. And it still has those really pretty floral notes, but that green tea, lemon, again, to the same formula, same cocktail, but nonetheless, like still really different and really delicious. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this tasting kit. I really encourage you to explore other varietals. Huge thanks to the National Honey Board. They provided me with a lot of resources. If you're looking for a local honey, if you go to honeylocator.com and you plug in your zip code, and a list of your local apiaries will come up. But you can always find local honeys like at your farmer's market. Even a lot of grocery stores carry local honeys too. Also, big thanks to Beam Suntory for making this happen. Both Sipsman and Roku Gin are part of their portfolio. Really, really lovely gins. Check them out. Thank you, everybody. Tune into, if you go to liquid-architecture.com under tasting experiences, I'm going to continue to have more of these tasting kits. So check that website out regularly. Thanks, everybody.